Greetings, folks. My name is Jess Tiergan, and today I am going to be performing a mock dissertation defense. And the dissertation that I'm going to be using for this project was written by MacLeod in 2013, and it is entitled Clinicians' Experience of Suicide Assessment from a Qualitative Perspective. All right, so I wanted to thank you all for coming here today and giving me your time and energy, and wanted to thank you all for your assistance and how you have helped me in this journey and how you've been with me and benefited me and been here and alongside me during this process. So this research project that turned into this dissertation was based upon the research question of how does the practice of suicide assessment affect individual clinicians in their professional practice, and how does it impact them in their personal lives. So it looked at how it impacts them in both their private practices or in the community mental health departments that they worked in, depending upon what the areas that the different clinicians worked in. It also looked at how it impacted them personally, their views of life, how they worked with other clients, etc. The author of this study used to work in the field of suicide assessment, and he had felt and watched the impact of performing suicide assessments on himself and seeing how it impacted his practice and how it impacted the practice of many of his fellow clinicians, many of his colleagues. And one of the reasons that this dissertation was of interest to me is I worked as a shift lead for a group of crisis clinicians for about 3 years, and a lot of our job was to focus on performing suicide assessments, homicide assessments, and grave disability assessments. So this work was super interesting to me as well because of some of the shared experiences that the author and I had. So this research was completed using a qualitative research method. The researcher explored the lived experience of 17 clinicians. All of these clinicians were based out of Southwest Michigan, and all of these clinicians assess suicidality as a risk factor of their clients as part of their professional work, a regular part of their work. Clinicians that did not regularly perform suicide assessments or had not performed suicide assessments in the recent past were excluded from this study. A phenomenological approach was used to interpret and understand the results of this study. Basically, the goal was to learn about this through lived experience and through the direct lived experience of those who could express it to us. So not studying our perception of what these clinicians experienced or these counselors experienced, but actually hearing from them what they experienced and allowing that to be in their own words. In-person interviews were conducted to gain this data, and these interviews were conducted at a place chosen by the participant. This was to give them a sense of control, a sense of autonomy, and also to increase the ability of certain people to be able to engage in the study, because certain folks had to do it outside of their home due to limited times, or certain folks were able to do it during work hours, but had to do it in different, like outside of their work or other opportunities like that. The participants were mostly known to the researcher, and they were intentionally chosen for their expertise in the crisis counseling field. The ones that were not known to the researcher were referred using a snowball effect by other participants in this study or other counselors who were known to the researcher. And this method was chosen because it was very important that the people that were chosen were able to provide a very rich and a very deep perspective on this topic, and not just that they, again, back to that phenomenological type of study that they would be able to provide actual experiences, that they had lived this, they had walked through this, they knew what this was like. And so instead of just something they had heard about or read about or maybe had heard secondhand, but wanted to use participants that actually understood and could provide experiences from their personal life. 4 broad interview questions were used to be the driving force and the structure for this study. And there were several subsections that were created within this. And the interviews were semi-structured. So the same questions were asked every participant. But there was a lot of room for the participants to share their own experience and for the participants to direct the interviews the way they wanted them to go. So some of the interviews looked very different than others of them. And these, the 4 areas that were assessed using these questions, the questions explored the way that clinicians assessed for suicide in clients, the professional impact of suicide assessments, the personal impact of suicide assessments, and how completing suicide assessments and being actively part of this suicide assessment system, how it changed the participants' worldview. So more of a macro or large system overview of how that impacted them. So when we were looking at the literature in regards to this subject, we noticed that there are a lot of different tools for evaluation of suicidality. There are lots. I can't give you an exact number. If that's something that you folks are interested in, and we can look into that more thoroughly. But there are many, many different tools. And these tools have different levels of research behind them. They have different levels of efficacy. But one thing that we have seen from the research, from the literature review, is that there's not much guidance of how to use them. So there's lots of information about these are the tools that are generally used, but there's not much guidance of how clinicians, how counselors should actually use them in a crisis situation with a suicidal client. Equally, when we're looking at risk factors of what gives us indication that a client might be suicidal, there is an extremely large level or extremely large number of risk factors. And these vary dramatically depending upon the researcher and depending upon what the researcher is looking at. And what it seems to look like from the research is that all of these risk factors are important. They all are indicators of someone being at risk of taking their own life, but none are absolute. So there aren't like 5 different risk factors that we can say if somebody has one of these, they are at high risk of taking their own life. There is a lot of different pieces that play into somebody being at the point where they end up taking their own life. And it is not a clear-cut decision. It is not a clear-cut assessment that the clinician gets to perform. There's also a lot of disagreement in the research about whether or not a formal assessment tools should be used. So some of the research indicates that a formal assessment tool allows us to have more accurate data and to have a better understanding of exactly what's going on with the client and avoid some of the subjectivity that could be present. But also some research shows us that these assessment tools miss a lot and perhaps give us an inaccurate view of the client's experiences and could cause us to have a time when if we did not use the formal assessment tools, we might have a better understanding of the actual risk factors and the actual risk that the client is at for suicidality. Overall, as we look at the research says that we cannot accurately predict suicidality. We have ways to try to do our best at this, but there is some element of lack, some realization that the counseling field has that we do not have the tools, the skills, the knowledge at this current time to accurately predict suicidality. Research has also shown us that the job of being a counselor is intrinsically stressful, and having a client die by suicide is particularly stressful. And clinicians that regularly work with clients that are higher acuity and are more likely to be suicidal, these counselors express higher levels of stress and higher levels of job stress. When we're looking at the results from this, so that's finishing up the literature review. When we're looking at the results of this particular study, the first question that was asked the participants was how they assessed clients and what that assessment process was like for them. And when they were talking about this, the clinicians generally agreed that they all use some form of tools. The tools that they used was very split and very diverse, which seems to accurately reflect what the literature review tells us, is that there's lots of different tools and there's not a set of tools that are the most accurate necessarily. And in these in the example and the results provided for us by these clinicians, there was a lot of different tools used. And also, the clinicians were very split on the usefulness of these tools. Some clinicians felt that they were very useful, some felt that they were minimally useful, and some felt that they were almost not useful at all. One thing that almost all the clinicians that were interviewed agreed on was that they wanted to screen for depression, that depression was one of the major components that they wanted to screen for, and also that they wanted to screen for client sincerity. And this wasn't necessarily something that they screened for in a formal way, but they wanted to screen for the sincerity of the client's suicidality or the sincerity of the client when they were denying suicidality. So that went both ways. The next question was in regards to the how their practice changed as a result, or their professional changes, and all of the clinicians agreed that they changed professionally and their practice changed as a result of performing suicide assessments. The main things that they discussed when they were talking about this was that they felt changes in energy. Some talked about an increase of energy, even like an adrenaline rush. Of this was the time when they could show up, they could be competent, they felt like they could do something, they could intervene, and there was some amount of that like adrenaline release of like, things are really serious right now, we need to get to work and make this happen. Also, the largest thing that was reported by the counselors was an increase in anxiety. And they saw that increased anxiety in their professional life and how they interacted with clients and how they ran their practice. Also, many of the counselors discussed an increase in emotional distance and depersonalization of the clients, so connecting with the clients less, both the direct clients that they were doing the assessment for, the suicidal clients, but also subsequent clients, and having this sense of being removed from them, distanced from them, and that was one way that they saw their professional life and their practice change because of doing the higher risk suicide assessments. The next questions addressed personal impact and how performing these suicide assessments impacted the personal lives of these clinicians. And the things that came up with this were elements like depression, sadness, and cynicism. Depression and cynicism were two of the major themes that came up for these folks. And this sense of like, we can't do anything about it, the system is not going to support us, the system will not support these people, and elements along that. The clinicians also talked about there just being a price to pay, and they realized the cost of their work and the difficulty of their work and how it's going to impact their personal life. And a lot of them said they just feel like that was the price they had to pay, and they felt like it was worth it. And they were willing to pay that price, even though it was hard. They also talked some about the feeling of like getting confused of which client was which, getting confused about what risk went to which client, and so this bleeds over a little bit into the professional, but they talked about it in regards to the personal because they felt like that said something about them personally, and there was a little bit of shame was another theme that came up when when they were talking about the anxiety and the adrenaline and how it impacted them, and this piece of not being able to keep client information straight. The final question set that was asked was in regards to how it changed their worldview. And the elements that came up with this were in regards to their limits of power, realizing that they do not have the ability to control much, and also the shortness of life. Many of the clinicians talked about how performing suicide assessments made them realize that life is very short and they have no promise of tomorrow, that the future is not guaranteed. And how that led into this idea of the importance of not taking life for granted, how they want to encourage their clients to not take life for granted, and also they in their personal lives want to not take life for granted. They also talked about how they felt like it increased their empathy, like they were able to understand both why people would want to live and also understand why people might be at a point where they wanted to die. And how before they did this work, they might think, why would anyone want to kill themselves? And after doing this work and these assessments, they're at a point of understanding that some people have very valid reasons, that the reasons they would feel are valid, and thus that empathy piece was able to be increased for them. At the end of the interviews, the clinicians were given the opportunity to say if there was anything else they wanted to add. And the two topics that came up for this was that many of the clinicians expressed how unprepared they felt by their education and how concerning this was for them, how much they felt like they were not prepared to perform these assessments, and how frustrating and how unhealthy this was for them, and how much they were aware of their lack of preparedness by the system and by the education system as well. The other thing they wanted to discuss more was the impact that losing a client to suicide had upon them. One of the rule-out criteria was that none of these clinicians had lost a client to suicide in the last 2 years, but many of them talked about how they had lost a client to suicide at some point in the past, and they really wanted to address this. And so that was another theme that came up, was the importance to them of actually addressing how that felt and what that experience was like. So the conclusions that were come to in this study as a wrap-up was that the training is not sufficient. The training that is provided to counselors for suicide assessment is not sufficient, and that anxiety impacts counselors who are performing these both professionally and personally, and that this impact is very, very strong on the participants that were part of this study. Also, this overarching idea of the autonomy that they wanted to give their patients versus the importance of doing their job, and where the hopelessness part came in, both as clinicians and for clients. Looking forward, some of the limitations of this study were the small sample size, and that the participants were all very intentionally chosen, and that they were all Caucasian and from a very limited location. And there is some ideas that an increase in diversity, racial diversity, and other forms of diversity could change some of these experiences and could shed more light on this. And the final arcing concept that came out of this study was that it is important to know the reason for living, and that there's always a thread of hope. As the participants were talking about death and talking about suicide, this main theme came up about the reason for living and the thread of hope in this. That concludes the and those elements of the reasons for living and the thread of hope pulls into what could be possible for future research, both broadening the sample sizes, looking at different more diverse persons, and also looking at this looking into more pushes of how training could be increased and what are some of the elements that get in the way of that, and then also looking into this theme of the reason for living and the theme of hope. Thank you very much for listening to this recording and this mock dissertation defense. I look forward to hearing any questions, concerns, or thoughts that you have. I appreciate you folks. Bye.